This week's probably going to be a turning point for a lot of people when it comes to Lovecraft Country. While the first episode was very, very topical and focused on a lot of racial issues, this episode was a lot more focused on the genre trappings of Lovecraftian horror. And if you are on the fence about the supernatural elements of this show, this might not have done it for you. And also there's how quickly everything happened. But before I get into my specific thoughts with spoilers, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing as I do upcoming reviews for shows and movies such as Raised by Wolves and The Boys. And if you're interested in seeing those videos, please consider subscribing, as I said. And if you'd give me a like, I'd really appreciate it. So getting into this episode, Whitey's on the Moon, with spoilers. So this show was kind of advertised as being something along the lines of Stranger Things, where it's kind of an 8 to 10 hour movie, but it's going to take a lot more episodic direction after this episode. And because of that, things really happened quickly in this episode, and a lot of things happened in this episode that you would normally see saved for the finale of a show. And I'm not actually very critical of this. I get tired of things getting stretched out over 8 to 10 hours when there's only enough plot for 3 to 4 hours. But I will say things did feel a little bit rushed here. I felt like we could have stood to get to know some of these characters a little bit more. And we've already lost 2 of the more well-known actors in the cast. Tony Goldwyn, who plays Samuel Braithwaite, the leader of this Sons of Adam group, he's already dead. He was introduced this week as a villain, and he's already a goner. Got killed during the ceremony with Atticus that went horribly wrong, and it wasn't really clear why it went horribly wrong, but we did see Hannah, who is Atticus's ancestor, show up, crash the ceremony apparently, and save Atticus, as it seems very much that he was going to be the sacrificial lamb needed to get Samuel in mortality. And again, this is something that you wouldn't have expected to happen until the finale in a normal show, and for it to happen in the second episode of a season is quite surprising. Uncle George also seems to have left the show. He seems to already be dead. He got shot by Samuel after the group tried to escape after rescuing Melrose from the cellar in the house, and after the death of Dell, played by Jamie Neumann from The Deuce. But this was pretty predictable, because if you were paying attention in episode 1, there was the scene between Uncle George and his wife on the phone where he, said basically all the stuff that you would say in a goodbye speech. And shows have a bad habit of giving their game away with these kinds of scenes. If you watched Game of Thrones, they did it with Ned Stark when he told Catelyn and Jon things that he would only have said to them if he was never going to see them again, and it was kind of obvious to the viewer that that was the case if you were paying attention. The only reason you wouldn't have expected it to happen to Uncle George is if you thought that this actor was too important to kill off. But Courtney B. Vance has better things to do, apparently, so that was all we're going to see of the character, at least in the present. They might have flashbacks and such. Before he left, he did do some important revealing, such as the fact that Atticus might not actually be Melrose's son. And what this means for the plot has yet to be revealed. It was unclear to me. I thought he might be implying that he was actually Atticus's father, and that would be an interesting twist for us to find out right before he dies. However, it could not be that, and it could be something else, and we'll have to wait and see what this significance is for the story. Interesting when you look at the troubled relationship between Melrose and Atticus, because this puts a whole different spin on it if Melrose doesn't necessarily know that Atticus is his son. Interesting that they had Hannah be the one to crash this ceremony, because I think it has a little bit of... There were a lot of aspects of this episode that had racial allegory to them. For instance, at the beginning of the episode when Letitia and Uncle George were dancing around looking at books and the wonderful clothing that had been left there for them, to the music from the Jeffersons. And it was a very buoyant scene, kind of reminded me of a scene with Paul Rudd in Ant-Man 2 where they were playing the Partridge Family theme song. But again, I wondered if there was like a racial allegory here and that these characters were being gaslit so that they would forget about their trauma, and so that they wouldn't realize that they were being held at this mansion against their will. And Atticus is the only one who's very, very clearly aware that something is very, very wrong. I found the characters of William, played by Jordan Patrick Smith, who was Ubba in Vikings, and I also found the character of Christina, who was Caleb in the book. I'm not sure why they gender swapped this character, but it doesn't really affect anything, so we'll go with it. Played by Abbey Lee. This was originally going to be Elizabeth Debicki, but she was too busy due to scheduling conflicts. I feel like this probably would have been a more interesting role if Elizabeth Debicki had played it. Abbey Lee is doing a fine job with what she's given, but I personally, just Elizabeth Debicki's a lot stronger as an actress, and she has a very, very strong ethereal quality. But Abbey Lee is kind of bringing that to the table as well. But these characters just don't have a lot of depth to them. None of the Braithwaites have had so far, and I guess technically that William is a friend of Christina and not actually a Braithwaite, but he has a similar vibe. I feel like there's something odd going on there. We'll find out more in future episodes probably, because it doesn't seem as though Christina or William were killed, even though the entire house was destroyed, so it's a little bit unclear how they wouldn't have been. But I liked having these characters on screen. I think they're a little bit too obviously up to no good. They kind of give off Slytherin vibes, but I do find them stylish and interesting, and I guess that's how I would describe this whole episode. It was all a little bit obvious, but it was stylish and interesting, so I kind of went with it. But again, I'm not sure how people will feel that this was so caught up in the genre trappings of Lovecraftian horror. I don't know how many people are approaching this show who are already familiar with Lovecraft and how many people just saw the trailer and were like, I'll come in and enjoy this. If you're someone who really enjoys Lovecraftian horror, the actual stories by Lovecraft, I'm interested to know what you think of this show, because I feel like you might have a different reaction than people who are just coming into it without any preconceptions. I'm not the biggest Lovecraft fan. I have liked a lot of Lovecraft-influenced films, such as the Alien franchise, particularly Prometheus and Alien Covenant, but I personally am not the biggest Lovecraft fan, so I don't mind this show at all. I don't mind what it's doing with Lovecraft, but I could see someone who was a Lovecraft purist not enjoying this very much. So I'd be interested to hear people's thoughts on that. There were some very interesting scenes this episode in the mansion. Obviously, the characters had these hallucinations. I don't know why they had these particular hallucinations. They didn't seem to have any particular theme in common. I kind of wished my wife had watched this episode with me. I would have loved to see her jump when the snake came out of a place where you would not normally expect to see a snake come. That probably would have had her shrieking and racing across the room, even though it was a very CGI snake. Doesn't matter. She just can't do snakes. Can't do snakes at all. And, you know, we got to see Jamie Chung again, who seems to be someone that Tick had a romantic relationship with when he was overseas in Vietnam, but we'll learn more about that character hopefully as the season goes on. But I did think that these visions just didn't really seem to have anything particular linking them, and I wasn't really sure as to the purpose of them. It seemed that they were being sent to them by Christina, perhaps to play with them. And Christina is an interesting character because she does seem to have values that are different than her father, but her loyalty to him seems to be causing her to stick around even though she doesn't agree with his sexism and his racism. And there was a very, very compelling scene this episode, probably the only compelling scene with the character of Samuel. As I said, Tony Goldwyn's already gone. Surprised he agreed to be on this show considering how little screen time and how little impact his character had. But the scene at dinner where Uncle George figured out that Atticus was a son among sons and thus outranked everyone in the room and had a legitimate claim to the authority over the group. That was a very, very interesting scene, and it was fascinating, though, how Samuel was the only person who would not acknowledge the authority, even though he acknowledged that the authority is legitimate, that he should obey what Atticus tells him. He says, well, basically, I have all the money and the power, and I'm not going to follow the rules of this thing that I claim to believe in so deeply, this belief system that I'm so deeply invested in. And that's kind of an interesting theme on a number of levels when someone who has power says, I'm not going to do what I claim to believe because I have power, and therefore I'm going to do what suits me. And I think we see this an awful lot in America today, and it's a very, very troubling thing. And I think we all have to grapple with being consistent with our belief systems, but obviously this was not a sympathetic portrayal of that struggle, more a portrayal of how a person really just doesn't care and abuses the belief system that they claim to be a part of. The ceremony at the end of this episode, I think, was probably the highlight of the episode. The use of the song Whitey's on the Moon during this sequence was just phenomenal. Really good music choice. Great special effects. And I wasn't scared or very tense this episode, which is probably a shortcoming of this episode. I think that the first episode was more frightening because we had the real world evils of racism in the South as they're traveling through, and you felt that tension constantly. And while there was some racism this episode, such as when Dell, played by Jamie Neumann, kind of implied that she felt that the black characters should be on a leash rather than the dogs, and made all these veiled comments about black people in general. Well, not that veiled. We had scenes like that, and scenes with Samuel, making kind of racial comments like the Garden of Eden was the last time that everybody knew their place, and since then everybody's kind of become upstarts. So we had those scenes, but for the most part this was focused on weird rituals and just exploring this mansion. And again, it was interesting that the mansion was destroyed so quickly this episode, and that Hannah was the one to crash the ceremony. It's interesting, this reckoning with one's heritage that Atticus is going through, this realization that his ancestor was a victim of sexual assault, and that he's the descendant both of this woman and of the person who sexually assaulted her. That's something that I think it would be very, very difficult to understand and to reconcile oneself with. But it's very, very interesting to see this character rescue him and to help him get out of that situation. And I felt that this sequence was rushed, but it was interesting. And I felt like the music choice really, really made it work, because it kind of showed the similar theme to the song, which is that, people have real problems. Poor people, and particularly black people, have real problems, and white people are just going out and doing things that, ain't nobody got time for that. Like, why would we care? And in this particular instance, they're perfectly willing to sacrifice Atticus to gain immortality, which backfires royally, and can't say that they didn't deserve it completely. So the only other scene that stood out to me this episode particularly was the scene where we got to see a Shoggoth born, and I'm interested that they had Christina be the one to witness this, because it's like the only scene this episode, I believe, in the first 2 episodes that wasn't from the viewpoint of the African American characters. And the books always did every single scene from an African American character. They didn't have any scenes where they shifted away to another character. So this was kind of an odd decision, in my opinion, to do that. And Christina's interesting, but obviously I think she is going to be an antagonistic character eventually. But so far they've portrayed her in a somewhat sympathetic way. She's protected Atticus and seems to be not comfortable with what her father is doing, but she's also stood idly by and let it happen. So how good is she really? So I enjoyed this episode. It went quickly. It was very entertaining, but I do feel that it lacked a lot of the elements that made the first episode so strong. The topicality, the willingness to engage with harsh subject matter, with hard issues, and with the pain of living in America at this time, in history in particular, as a black person. So I felt like a lot of that was kind of shunted to the side in favor of, as I said, the more Lovecraftian genre trappings. So I'm not sure how people will feel about that, if that will make people more engaged with the show because they'll be more entertained and they'll be more interested in these aspects, or if people will feel that it's just kind of a cop-out to go this route instead of to explore the harsher realities that the first episode explored. So those are my thoughts, but let me know what you thought in the comments. If you're interested in seeing more reviews like this one, please consider subscribing. And as always, you can watch more videos right now.